Yes, it is. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's 9:15. We should start. It's my privilege as a retired member of staff to open this course and to welcome you. I'm Hugh Amor. I'm going to introduce our speaker, our lecturer for this week, very, very briefly. Anita Georgievska-Shine is here. You can't hear me? Okay. She's going to give this absolutely fascinating series of lectures on a topic that I think must interest all of us. The upheaval before, during, and after the First World War, the upheaval in Russia with the revolution in 1917, and the impact of all of this on creativity and art in all its manifestations. I think we're in for a major treat. It's my privilege, therefore, without further ado, to welcome Anita Georgievska-Shine and to introduce her to you and to ask her to start her series of lectures. Thank you.
To make sure it doesn't fall. Where do you want this to be? Here. Okay. Other side. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming so early in the day for this series of talks. I wish to thank Mehdi, the director of the summer school program, for inviting me to come here. I have come from United States of America, actually, this time. I live in Washington, D.C., but originally I'm from Macedonia, which used to be not Macedonia with Greece. Oftentimes they're confused, but Macedonia, which used to be part of former Yugoslavia. Well, that former Yugoslavia actually goes back to World War I in a certain sense. Actually, the peace treaty that was never a proper peace treaty, the conference at Versailles, and then the creation of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which then led to the creation of the country of Yugoslavia, in which I grew up as a child, and which fell apart in '91. We were just talking with Hugh about the fact that the Versailles Peace Treaty was so unfortunate for most of European history afterwards for the next 70 years or so, and we're still living through the consequences. But just to say briefly also that I wish to thank here Mr. Monroe Bloch, who many of you know, because the reason I'm here is that I was giving a series of lectures through the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where I occasionally lecture, on a cruise ship that Monroe and his wife Linda were at. And we started talking, and then we spoke about this possibility of coming for the summer school in Cape Town. And we managed to get in touch, thanks to him, with the organizers of the program. And this is how I ended up here. So I'm glad to be here for the first time in Cape Town. Thanks again. So, this will be a series of 5 talks about primarily artists, visual artists, occasionally a mention of a poet, a writer, who were active around World War I. And what you see here on the picture, the first unit, The Romance of Disaster, is about the works of art that somehow anticipated World War I, or that somehow almost artists who somehow even encouraged change in Europe. The Romance of Disaster is just the title I gave to this unit, but who you see on the picture, it's the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, the assassination in Sarajevo in 1914, that was the start of all of the hostilities that spread so quickly throughout Europe. And of course, dulce decorum est is a famous line from the poem by Wilfred Owen that I will go to towards the end of the presentation. But this is what Europe looks like on the eve of World War I. And this is how the alliances are created in 1914, where you have all of the sides identified here. You have the Triple Alliance. Those are the Germany, Italy, Austro-Hungary, of course. This marks the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the beginning of World War I de facto. It's a dual monarchy at that time. And of course, these are the same kind of parties that will be replicated later on or in a similar way in World War II. So you have the Russian allies over there. You see Serbia and Montenegro, which is interesting because Serbia will play an instrumental role in the beginning of World War I. And then, of course, you have the Triple Entente, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and you see the French-dominated Northern Africa on the map. But, as I mentioned already, everything begins in a way on June 28, 1914. And these are the Archduke and his wife emerging from a town hall, boarding the car, and this is a few minutes before the assassination. And there have been all these little stories written since, especially a couple of years ago, in 2014, people were writing a lot about how it all began. And they were saying, my God, if they hadn't been late, if there hadn't been clogged up at that particular street, if they had turned on another corner, this would have never happened. Well, maybe the assassination would not have happened, but the war seems to have been inevitable. The assassination was just what pushed all of these hostilities over the brink. But actually, there were all these unresolved issues among these great parties, the great empires or former empires of Europe. So who was the assassin? The assassin was the young man you see over there, Gavrilo Princip, a Serb nationalist who was member of an organization called the Black Hand. It was a nationalist organization of Slavs, primarily Serbs, primarily centered in Serbia and present-day Bosnia and Herzegovina. And what they were trying to do is liberate Bosnia from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is again part of a long process that goes back to the independence of Serbia from the Turkish Empire in the late 19th century. So it all goes back to the complicated issue of nation-state building in Europe. So obviously all these Slavs living in Bosnia at that time under Austro-Hungarians were hoping to create an independent Slav-dominated country there. And Gavrilo Princip was captured after the assassination and died a few years later in prison. But he did kill the Archduke, and that was essentially, it marked the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And very shortly after June 28, this attack, this is just a brief representation of the events. And I'm just showing you a synopsis here, a very brief summary of what happened, and I'm stopping October 29th. But you can see that on July 5th, Kaiser William II promises German support for Austria against Serbia. So it starts with Austria retaliating or attacking Serbia, which was an independent country, but Gavrilo Princip being a Serb in Bosnia, that's how the connection went. Then you have immediately July 28th, that's the formal declaration of Austria against Serbia, the war. Then Germany declares war on Russia August 1st. Then you have already Belgium. You have France and Belgium being invaded by Germany. August 4th, Britain declares war on Germany. Then you have invasion of France. Then you have defeat of the Russian army, first defeat. Then you have one of the major battles begins September 6th on Marne, then the first battle on Ypres, then Turkey enters the war on Germany's side, October 18, and then the trench warfare starts to dominate the Western Front, October 29th. So it goes extremely quickly from June 28th to October 29th. And there are so many warring factions and parties and all these alliances being quickly formed of one country against another, and there is an awful lot of propaganda happening everywhere. And before we get to the visual propaganda, just to give you this list of the military casualties. Once again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a sense of how many human beings lost their lives. So just look at this. Belgium, 45. British Empire, with all kinds of parts of the British Empire being engaged, 942. France, 1,400,000 almost. Then Greece, Italy, huge number, 680. Okay, then you can see Russia, 1,700,000. Serbia itself, 45. United States, which entered the war in 1917, 116,000. Austro-Hungary, 1,200,000, etc. Germany, 2 million. Ottoman Empire, huge amount of casualties, 725,000.
Those deaths or deaths and casualties?
These are casualties, military casualties, deaths and casualties. Nonetheless, these are huge numbers. And of course, very quickly thereafter, you have all these visual arts being used for propaganda purposes. And you can see here, for instance, this British propaganda poster from 1915 is inviting people, step into your place. This is your place. And what's fascinating when you look at them is how many diverse people are brought in together. The workers, the gentlemen, the judges, the academics, everybody who has to take his place in this engagement. And then, of course, you have things like this being published, posters that, you know, use humor in a certain way and try to enlist young men, to encourage them to enlist. Wanted smart men for the Tank Corps. Let Professor Tank teach you a trade. So here we go. From the university, you go right into the trenches and learning how to drive these new, fascinating machines. And that's another thing which is very interesting. Professor Tank teach you a trade. The idea being that this war is associated from the get-go with new technologies. It's associated with the kind of sophisticated military machines, with something that will change the way in which we have waged war in Europe up until this point. So there is this business of modernity and progress that's present even in this advertising for the war and the calls to young people to enlist. And then, of course, at the same time, while they talk about progress and modernity, they also appeal to chivalric spirits. They appeal to tradition. So here, Britain needs you at once, and there is the knight, St. George against the dragon, of course, St. George being the patron saint of England. And there you have, you know, every young British man is again the new St. George in his armor, fighting for the country. And look at the posters that appeal to the women. Do you realize that if you keep back a son or sweetheart, you're prolonging the war? You have to send as many of them as possible, adding to the peril of those who have gone. So yes, there was this feeling of obviously almost an obligation, patriotic obligation to join this effort, although nobody quite knew why, as you know, because it wasn't black and white like in World War II. It was much more complicated in terms of obligations and responsibility and who is an aggressor and why we are doing this in the first place. In the colonies, in the British colonies, look at these posters. All eligible men will be given free trip to Europe. Clothing, food, money, steamer, train accommodation, and a trip full of adventure and interest, forming the greatest event of their lives, to do their duty at the place where every fit Australian should be, standing shoulder to shoulder with his present defenders in Europe. Invitations on themselves, diplomas of honor forever, will be issued and commandership established today on application to every recruiting officer. That's the small print I'm reading. So the large strip, and then the large print, and then all of the small print that tells you what all these people are getting when they join the effort from Australia.
Can I ask something? They were volunteers at the beginning, not conscripts in the war.
Right. So they were volunteers and they were conscripts as well, but there were plenty of people who volunteered for the effort, indeed, from all sides. Yes. And then, of course, this is a recruitment poster in India. In Urdu, you have an inscription saying, who will take this uniform, money and rifle? Yes. So it's all this business of prestige. You're becoming a gentleman, part of this great effort when you join the war. And this is a German poster, just for balance purposes. So you can see how here, for example, in German Gothic script, of course, again, an appeal to education. Like the commander tank, the professor tank teaching a lesson. Here, good books, good comrades. And this is kind of addressed to the soldier. You too give often and of many kinds. May a good book always be at hand. So the soldier is getting ready to the front and he's carrying a good book because the good book will be his best companion there. So this is especially poignant when you think about the fact that so many educated people, right, went to that war. I mean, the number of upper class people, at least from standpoint of education, but also class-wise, social position, who ended up going to the trenches, volunteering for patriotic reasons on all sides, and the number of these people who were killed or disabled for the rest of their lives, emotionally or physically, is astounding. So here you have, for example, a German poster. I'm just giving you this brief look at the various posters that called people to action, and this is fascinating. 21 examples of the uniforms of France, Great Britain, and Belgium. And this is essentially the uniforms of our enemies in the West. So Germans, being Germans and always being very interested in taxonomy, in classification, in organization, in knowledge, they create this very nice visual representation of the uniforms. So when you go and start killing people, you know who you're hitting. It was very confusing there. Obviously, you had the trench war and you had very firmly established positions in the trenches, in the lines, on all of the fronts, but you also would encounter various soldiers from various parties, so you better know how each one of your enemies looks. So this is how visual arts were very, very quickly kind of appropriated by the warring sides for propaganda purposes. But here, just to conclude with this overview, they were also used to tell people that the war will have incredibly catastrophic consequences unless they give their best. And this is, for example, a 1918 poster when the German side is losing already, but they're desperately trying to tell people to kind of stay there and resist, because this is how it will look in German lands if the French reach the Rhine. So that's the poster. So this is this mass-produced imagery that goes everywhere in order to keep that awareness among the people. But how did it all begin? I'm not going to talk about the politics that led and the socioeconomic factors in Europe that led to the World War I. I will talk now a little bit about artists and intellectuals who somehow anticipated that something was going to happen in Europe. And one group of artists who we typically see as champions of World War I, in a sense, were the Italian futurists. And here I'm showing you a nice-looking, proper-looking gentleman, Filippo Marinetti, who lived until 1944, but he launched this movement in Italy, Futurism, in 1909. And he wrote, actually, a futurist manifesto. And it appeared on the front page of the French newspaper Le Figaro. Now, are you familiar with futurism as a movement? Italian movement? Okay. So the name itself tells you something. These are people who love the idea of modernity and progress and the future. So they call themselves futurists, and this happens around the same time when Picasso is developing cubism in Paris. So they're all enchanted with the idea of all this new machinery and how our civilization will be changed profoundly. But in the case of the futurists, there is also this feeling that the old world has to be killed and destroyed before the new world is built. So a number of these art movements that happen in the years leading to World War I are talking about the need to have some kind of fundamental transformation of the order of things as we know them. And I'll just read to you a segment from the Futurist Manifesto. This is incredibly aggressive, incredibly sort of chaotic sounding. It doesn't work. I mean, there is no systematic thinking, but they're very anarchistically inclined. They like to shock the audience with their language. And if you look at just a few lines, this is how he calls his friends to join the futurist movement. Let's go, friends, away, let's go. Mythology and the mystic ideal are defeated at last. We don't need classical mythology. We don't need any of that old stuff from European culture. We are about to see the centaur's birth. And soon after, the first flight of angels. This is crazy. I mean, the more you read, the crazier it gets. Why do they like centaur? The idea of centaur, I want to highlight that. Centaur is one of the mythical animals from ancient Greece, right? Who is half human, half beast. And the centaur, ever since antiquity, was seen as this uncontrollable creature that possesses both human nature and something that can never be sort of caged or controlled. So therefore, the centaur is something that appeals to people who like to fight against status quo, against the established order. It's a monster, but they say, we want the birth of the centaur. And then he says, oh, there is nothing to match the splendor of the sun's red sword. Instead of the sun's light, a red sword, slashing for the first time through our millennial gloom. We went up to the three snorting beasts. This is like the book of Apocalypse, to lay amorous hands on their torrid breasts. So we appeal to everything that's aggressive and wild and uncontrollable in human nature. We want to destroy civilization. And then he says, the raging broom of madness swept us out of ourselves, drove us through streets as rough and deep as the beds of torrents, etc., etc. So this is, for example, the founding manifesto, and 1909, published on the front page of the French paper Le Figaro. So it tells you that they're trying to become visible, very visible as a movement. And this is how it continues. I cannot read all of it, but I just want to highlight a couple of lines, and you can read while I have the slide on. For example, we intend to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and fearlessness, right under the capital letters, you see that. Courage, audacity, and revolt will be essential elements of our poetry. Then we intend to exalt aggressive action, feverish insomnia, racer stride, mortal leap, punch and a slap. And then we affirm that the world's magnificence has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed, a racing car whose hood is adorned with great pipes like serpents of explosive breath. A roaring car that seems to ride on grape shot is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace, Nike. And there is that beautiful Nike, of course, the symbol of human aspiration and victory, the headless statue, the famous classical statue of Nike, and they're saying that the car is far more beautiful than Nike. And they basically are saying this modernity is what will save us, what will rehabilitate us as civilization, because Western civilization is moribund. And this is the cover of the Figaro. And then, of course, I'll just read the closing lines here. We will glorify war, the world's only hygiene, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for woman. There is no place for women in this society. We'll destroy the museums, libraries, academies of every kind. will fight moralism, feminism, every opportunistic or utilitarian cowardice. It's crazy, but it worked. They had sympathizers, and they wrote poetry like this, they published, newspapers, magazines, the futurists in Italy, and they really were very much on the forefront during those first years of the war, calling people to action. And they started in 1909. And here are just a couple of them. This guy died as quickly as he went to the trenches. 1916, Umberto Boccioni. He's one of the futurists. And that's his self-portrait in 1909. And I just want to show you a couple of his images. This is called The City Rises, 1910. You see all this business of the wild animals, the centaurs, the horses in the middle of the city, this mixture of something that's very civilized and modern with something very primitive. And this is the leitmotif of artists working around World War I. This interest in connecting what is most up-to-date with what is most primitive in the human psyche. So this is why you have this incredible vortex of forms, all these forms colliding together, mixing together. You don't know if they're cars, machines, or horses, and a man trying to keep those horses. And here is another Umberto Boccioni. This is 1911, so this is basically before the war. Look how they're seeing that all these changes will happen in Europe. This is just called The States of Mind, Farewells, 1911. And essentially what he says in, sorry about that spelling here, in the introduction to a 1912 exhibition, he says, the picture must be a synthesis of what one remembers and what one sees. What he means by that, and this looks like a completely abstract play of these violent lines. You feel this sense of violence in all of their images? And this abstract play is, abstraction for them is important because what they're interested in is the energy around forms rather than forms themselves. So that energy is finally reduced to these lines that curve through space and create this sort of heroic sense of fire or diagonals. And when he says that it has to be a synthesis of what one has seen and remembered, is because futurists are also very interested in capturing time. All of their images are about visions of something in the process of becoming, in the process of changing, in the process of being. You cannot just document the world as you see it. You have to document the world as a process, as something that is constantly in action. Here is another example of the typical futurist painting, Umberto Boccioni. This is called The Charge of the Lancers. You see again, war, military. This is before he goes to the front. So the knighthood, but also the knighthood in this very modern language. But it's about battles. That's what they're interested in. And this is finally another painting, Dynamism of a Man's Head. I mean, this is 100 years ago. By now, we have gotten so used to this kind of modern pictures that look to us cubist, that look to us very abstract. But we have to keep reminding ourselves that none of these pictures were intended to be decoration anywhere. They were intended to be statements about ideology, ways of thinking. And this is what Boccioni is showing us, the dynamism of a head. In other words, that we are not something fixed. We are the process of our thoughts. And of course, this is maybe his most famous sculpture, which is a paraphrase of Nike. And it's called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, 1913. In other words, this is about creating a new kind of monument for the new world that's about to go to war. And there you have this person, instead of the goddess Nike, what you have is a masculine form, and what you have is a form that looks like he's wearing a helmet and armor. And you see a form that's extremely edgy, angular, On the one hand, flows through space. On the other hand, looks like it's cutting through the air, cutting through space. And most important of all, instead of a monument, it's a figure in motion. Again, the business of progress. Look, the kind of work they create. Boccioni, actually. This is a destroyed sculpture. We only have it from black and white photograph. The same here. Obviously, because he died in the war in 1916, there was no time to cast his sculptures. So he made models for the sculptures that went, and then they were destroyed, but we have just documents of what they looked like. And here is another one. You see, by 1909, people, these futurists in Italy, this Gino Severini now, this is called the Dance of the Pen at the Monaco Club, and by 1909, they are first and foremost interested in the world as something that's constantly in flux, in motion, something that's constantly changing in front of your eyes. Nothing is stable in their worldview, which is why they're interested in this imagery of nightclubs or street scenes. And you can see it's similar to cubism, to what Picasso is doing, but it's also their own sort of paraphrase or interpretation of cubism, and everything is so broken up into all these oranges and reds and greens. It's all rather chaotic and rhythmical and moving. And here is another guy, Carlo Cara. And this actually is commemorative picture of the funeral of an anarchist. Italian anarchists are quite present on the political scene in that country at this moment as well, as they were present in Russia, as they were present in Germany. You had anarchistic movement in many, many European countries at this point, but the Italian anarchists were particularly strong. What did they want? They didn't know. Just destroy what exists out there and have some kind of impossible horizontal structure where everybody can exercise his will, right? Fundamentally antisocial. So here is a funeral at which the anarchists created a revolt during the funeral of one of their fellow anarchists. And actually, in 1912, in another manifesto, they kept publishing these manifestos, the futurists. They wrote a statement that possibly refers to this picture by Carlo Cara, the funeral of the anarchist. They created a riot. They purposefully created this, and they said, if we paint the faces of a riot, the crowd bustling with uplifted fists and noisy onslaughts of the cavalry are translated upon the canvas in sheaves of lines corresponding with all of the conflicting forces, following the general law of violence of the picture. So this is what they want to convey, this negative energy within the picture that provokes more negative energy in reality. Not very nice, not very constructive, but that was their program. So, were Italians alone in doing this? No. Anarchistic movements, as I mentioned, existed in many European countries, and I just want to mention here not necessarily anarchists, but also revolutionary-minded people in England, the vorticists. The vorticists are probably even more obscure than the Italian futurists, although last year, for example, in MoMA, there was a very interesting exhibition of vorticist imagery. The name comes from the idea of vortex, like a vortex of energy. Again, this whole notion of destroying what exists. And this is a painting by one of the vorticists, William Roberts, who documents the appearance of the group at a restaurant in England. This is painted in spring of 1915, and what they're holding here is Blast. Blast is the magazine they published. Just consider the title, Blast, Destruction. So they also advocated sort of war as a way of cleansing society. Kind of Malthusian notions of how you can only transform if you destroy first. And these are actually at that particular restaurant in England. And here are all of the people who have been identified the person who you probably know, Ezra Pound. Of course, he was member of the Vorticists in England. Wyndham Lewis was the leader of the Vorticists, or he was the editor of the magazine Blast. But Pound was very important. And then here I'm just going to show you some of the statements from the first issue of the magazine Vortex, written by Wyndham Lewis. And you can see, we stand for the reality of the present, not for the sentimental future or the sacrificed past. And then, let me see. Yes, we do not want, this is what he says, I'm not going to read the whole statement, but he doesn't want to say that they're futurists. They're different from the futurists. And he says, we do not want to change the appearance of the world because we are not naturalists, impressionists, or futurists, that he dismisses as the latest form of impressionism. We do not depend on the appearance of the world for our art. What they're saying is we are not interested in translating the visible world into works of art. On the contrary, we just want the world to live, and we want to feel its crude energy flowing through us. Once again, energy, vitality, motion. So they say, we are not futurists, but they're just like the futurists in some respect. And once again, it's this business of extreme modernity with primitivism that they're going for, the connection between the two. Look at this. Look at how they write. We are proud, handsome, predatory. We hunt machines. They are our favorite game. We hunt machines. We invent them and hunt them down. This is a great vorticist age, a great still age of artists. So this is published in 2010. And look at this when he says, what is the vortex? The vortex rushes out like an angry dog at your impressionistic fuss. Our vortex is white and abstract with its red-hot swiftness. Did you ever know that there were these artists writing in such violent fashion?
Do you mean 1910?
1910. Oh, 2010, 1910, of course. It could be written in 2010. It could be written. Not much has changed. Not much has changed, I'm afraid. This is the first issue, the war number of Blast, July 1915, where Wyndham Lewis actually created the image for the cover. And you see, it's very abstract and very geometric. But the important thing you will notice in all of these artists, whether the futurists or the vorticists, tendency towards jagged lines and very, very clashing colors, and also this kind of graphic language of black and white, aggressive, edgy, without soft lines and contours. This is the absolute sort of opposite of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. And of course, look at the way in which the magazine is published. Does this make sense? Hardly, when you read the lines. This is what they call concrete poetry or graphic poetry. Big letters, small letters, clash of messages, creation of a noise, mental noise. And you can see that, yes, it was only published twice, of course. That was it. The first number and then the second war issue. And here are some more of their examples of graphic poetry. Bless the hairdresser, he attacks Mother Nature for a small fee. He makes systematic mercenary war on this wildness. What is all this about? Why nonsense? Why nonsense? A lot of art around World War I is about nonsense. Why? Because the world is in nonsense. The art reflects, the art becomes self-consciously a mirror of a dysfunctional world. So this is not about pleasant pictures. It's not about beauty. Quite the contrary, it's about ugliness, and it's about not making sense. There is a lot of anger. There is a lot of disenchantment with reason. There is a lot of appeal to absurdism because the world is absurd. That's how they see it. And hence they come up with stuff like this, correcting the grotesque anachronism of our physique. That's about, again, the ode to the hairdresser, bless the hairdresser. And these are the kinds of images, again, Wyndham Lewis. It's called workshop. And 1914, 1915, why workshop? They're also interested in taking down the artist from that celestial sphere of the individual genius towards something that's far more practical. We are artists who are also celebrating this sense that everything in society has to be integrated. We have to become engineers of society. We are like working in a workshop, transforming the way the world is, and celebrating all of those sort of manufacturing aspects of the world, this industry, this whole notion of fashioning something new. It's a wonderful painting. To my mind, it's still beautiful, but it's not a painting where you can easily read it, easily understand what he's trying to say, because it's not descriptive, it's expressive. It tries to express this new sense of self, if you will, in the modern incoherent world. And here is another guy, David Bomberg from the Vorticists. What in the world is this called? The Mud Bath, 1914. So this is on the eve, or right around World War I. You look at the title, you look at the picture, you're wondering, is there a fight here, a struggle, a game, a play? Why is everything looking so geometric? At the same time, they look humanoid, like figures in space. But they purposefully try to confuse you and create this dissonance in the head, so you struggle to figure out what the language is all about, just like in the concrete poetry we saw. And of course, these bright graphic colors, like posters. And here is another person, Sir Jacob Epstein, and this is actually a study for the rock drill from 1913. And this is what he says, writing in an autobiography in 1940. He lived through this whole chaos, and he actually was quite distinguished sculptor after World War I. And he says, it was in the experimental pre-war days of 1913 that I was fired up to do the rock drill. My ardor for machinery, everybody loved machinery, expanded upon the purchase of an actual drill. And upon this, I made and mounted a machine-like robot. He drew it, he imagined the drill, and then he created a robot on top of it. Visored, menacing, carrying within itself its progeny, protectively ensconced. Here is the armed, sinister figure of today and tomorrow. No humanity, only the terrible Frankenstein's monster we have made ourselves into. So you didn't need the assassination in 1914 to feel that there was a huge crisis in Europe. And all these people were sensing that something needs to change. So this love of the machine, but also fear of the machine and the Frankenstein they have created. And I want to conclude this discussion of the vortices by looking at an artist who is one of the more tragic figures. Well, look at his years, 1891 to 1915. He went as a volunteer and died within months. Henri Gaudibert-Bjeshka, very strange, complicated last name. He was a French artist, lived in Britain, and he was a friend of Ezra Pound's and of Jacob Epstein. And yes, he had a girlfriend who was Polish, and he took her last name, rather unusual, Sophie Bjeshka. So he died at age 23, and I just want to show you a couple of his sculptures because recently he has become quite interesting. There were a couple of retrospectives in England a few years ago of Bjeshka's work. He was full of promise, but you know, there was just an intimation of what he could have done as an artist. That's a portrait of his beloved, the woman that he lived with, Sophie Bjeshka. And apparently, yes, she was so traumatized by the loss that she kind of ended up in a mental hospital after his death in the war and died in 1925. There was a movie by Ken Russell many years ago called Savage Messiah, which is dedicated to this sculptor, Henri Gaudier-Břeška, but I don't think how available that film is these days. It was made in the 70s, and I saw it too long ago. But you can see that he started out in a way that's evocative of something like Paul Gauguin, that sort of post-impressionistic manner or language with vivid colors, and of course like early Matisse. So there is this whole movement at the beginning of the century towards these bright colors, a sense of exoticism, a sense of primitivism. Once again, I keep going back to that word primitive, because primitive for this avant-garde artist was a positive attribute, needless to say, because they were so sick and tired of the academic painting. So they wanted to infuse fresh energy into painting by going to non-European sources, non-academic sources, Picasso with African masks, Gauguin in Tahiti, and all of that stuff. And primitivism for them was far more full of vital energy, something that can recreate European civilization anew. And this is just you can imagine how anarchistic and his own work is. This is in 1912. A rather rude sculpture head that looks just very essentialist, like an essential human head in anguish, called Idiot Self-Portrait, that was cast in metal after his death. And this is him again with one of his crazy works called Bird Swallowing a Fish, 1914, right at the beginning of the war. And why this business of bird swallowing a fish? Everything is after everything else in nature. We don't want to talk about the peace and beauty and harmony. We are talking about existence, and we are talking about ways in which everybody is predator upon everybody else. So a bird swallowing a fish. Many of his works were destroyed. Here is a very primitivist seated woman, and here is another a dancing woman. You can see very self-consciously simple, reductive, kind of cubist forms. Not beautiful, not beautiful. And here is this crazy piece that he created. Actually, it's in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. It's not always on view. And they sometimes say, is it a masterpiece or a phallic monstrosity? Because basically Ezra Pound said, why don't you make a portrait of me in sculpture? And he said, I want the portrait to be virile. And that is virile portrait, yes. And there was a writer already at that time who was horrified. He thought that both the intention of Ezra Pound and the object were rather pornographic. And the head was actually owned for a while by Ford Madox Ford. So they were all in the same circles, these writers and artists. But this whole notion of creating very primitive sculpture head of Ezra Pound, because Ezra Pound also wanted to push this new way of thinking about poetry and changing the world through poetry. And there he is carving the head of Ezra Pound. It's a pretty large piece. His biggest sculpture, actually. And then this is very interesting that Ezra Pound wrote about Gaudier-Břeška after Gaudier-Břeška's death. So that's quite an interesting document about their relationship, if you're interested in learning more about him. And this is the second issue of the Blast magazine I mentioned earlier, the second and last issue of Wyndham Lewis's magazine, where you have here the letters that appear by Gaudier-Břeška from the front. I don't have time to read the entire letter, but the big irony is that essentially he goes there, writes these letters, and by the time the letters are published in the Blast #2, he's dead already. So this is posthumous publication. And basically, he says here, let me Yeah, this is very nice here. He has been written from the trenches. He has been fighting for 2 months. And I'll just read some of the segments of these letters. I have been fighting for 2 months, and I can now gauge the intensity of life. Human masses steam and move, are destroyed and crop up again. Horses are worn out in 3 weeks, die by the roadside. Dogs wander, are destroyed, others come along. And then this is what he says: with all the destruction that works around us, nothing is changed, even superficially. Life is the same strength, the moving agent that permits the small individual to assert himself. Strange, strange, strange. I mean, the sentiment is still there, the advocacy of war. And then he says, it would be folly to seek artistic emotions amid these little works of ours as human beings, what we do as human beings in the war. So he continues, this is just a drawing. I'll just, whatever is underlined there, I want to read. Even though all of this has been seen and witnessed by him, all this death and destruction, he claims my views on sculpture remain absolutely the same. Sculpture is the vortex of will, of decision that begins. And then he keeps talking about abstraction. I shall derive my emotions solely from arrangements of surfaces. I shall present by emotions the arrangement of my surfaces, the planes and lines by which they are defined. So it's a very, very interesting way of understanding or trying to understand this absolutely misdirected energy and emotions of these young people at the beginning of the war, both the futurists in Italy and the vorticists in England. And basically, when they say, when they talk about art, they keep talking about it even while they're in the trenches, even though towards the end of this letter, what he says here is that he takes a gun and he breaks off the butt of the gun and carves an image in it and transforms all of a sudden the murder instrument into something that he calls a work of art. He says, I have made an experiment 2 days ago. I pinched from an enemy a Mauser rifle. Its heavy, unwieldy shape swamped me with a powerful image of brutality. I was in doubt for a long time whether it pleased or displeased me. I found that I didn't like it. I broke the butt off, and with my knife I carved in it a design through which I tried to express a gentler order of feeling, which I preferred. So there is this internal conflict. Which way do I go? Do I embrace the war? Do I turn it into a work of art? Do I want to come up with new feelings? And this is unfortunately how many of these people were as they went to the war and began dying quickly thereafter within a month or two. I think that in the interest of time, it's 10:08. I have to stop here. So I presented to you 2 movements today, right before World War I, the futurists and the vorticists, and we will continue to discuss this through the next few days. So we'll talk about artists from the German side who went to the war and were killed immediately, French artists who suffered, then artists who remained alive and who essentially are the memory keepers, so to speak, artists who walked out of the war with war trauma and who tried to speak about death through their work afterwards. So it will be, unfortunately, it's a kind of course in which the images are not going to be very pleasant, but that's what they're painting, the world as they saw it. So thank you for your attention. If you have questions, let me know. Yeah, I mean, it's Malthus, you know, yeah. It's essentially all of this Darwinian or Malthusian, very kind of crude and very cruel theorizing about the fact that the world we have created cannot sustain us. I mean, that we have to purge. Absolutely. They felt that war is a way of social hygiene. Both the futurists and the vorticists. It's very cruel, but they were so desperate, they didn't know which way to go, and they saw some kind of possible exit in this modern warfare that will destroy whoever is not fit to remain alive, and then we will create a new world. And our art has to be hostile to the old art, the way the war will be hostile to everybody who is not fit to survive. It must be some kind of reflection on Darwin. I mean, after all these things were happening intellectually at this time, beginning of 20th century. And also people have oftentimes said that futurists and to some degree vorticists, because of their preoccupation with movement and transformation, are reflecting upon the theory of relativity, all these discussions about being in time, that nothing in the world is fixed, that everything exists sort of in a flux, in a constant motion. And of course, the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century has an impact on their mentality. So all of these things are happening together. And the idea that the old order cannot go on, most definitely. Yes?
The old order was particularly suffocating, wasn't it? I'm thinking of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for instance, right? Everything had reached a sort of stasis, the society was all sort of, very bourgeois, and everything just sort of continued.
Yeah, and unsustainable in terms of what they occupied and all these different people who were within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yes, an old empire. Why Italian futurists? Why futurism happened in Italy? Because Italians, I have a feeling, were trying to catch up with the other moderns at this point. They felt that they needed to reclaim the glory of the Renaissance, how they had brought about change in the Renaissance, and now this was after the reunification of Italy, so there was this nationalism in Italy after the end of 19th century, and they felt, we cannot just be a second violin to Paris, because everything was happening in Paris around 1900 to 1908. Actually, after Impressionism, from the 1880s, Paris was the artistic center, and Italians felt that they needed to reassert the power of Italy after the reunification of Italy. So I guess that may be part of the futurist background. But it's an interesting question. Why did it happen in Italy? And they really, not only did they volunteer for the war, they actively called other intellectuals to join the Italian side.
Excuse me, but the reverse is true for vorticism, because in the English you've got the colonialism, almost unlike Victorian power.
Absolutely. Vorticism is also a reflection upon a feeling of the British Empire and the stasis in the British Empire and how it needs to change, and the colonial power and the fact that things are happening in all of the colonies in one form or another, a feeling that this cannot go on.
But what is the trigger for vorticism?
The trigger for vorticism, I don't really know, except that I must say simultaneously throughout Europe, in many cultural centers, and we'll talk about Germany as well, and we'll talk about the Blau Reiter movement right before World War I. In all of these cultural centers of Europe, there is a feeling that we have to go from the beginning to renew ourselves. French are even less present at this moment in this aggressive fashion. Cubism rules in France. And it's not very militaristic per se, even though it's very